Abe Gordon is a radio veteran. Those portraits, those paintings behind him are actually real Picasso. This is what Abe Gordon does. He gets quality work as far as artwork, and also he's great in the sports media field as well. He is currently morning show producer 92.9 The Game in Atlanta, and a man who has circumnavigated this country, working in all different parts, chasing his dreams, working in radio as a host, as an anchor, as a producer. The guy is a Swiss Army knife. He can do it all. And he, over his career so far, has accumulated a lot of stories. And we also have to remind everybody that his dog, Chipper, 8 years old, named after Chipper Jones. So the fact that he's back in Atlanta getting to cover the Braves is sort of a full circle moment for him. I'm Bryan Fenley, an anchor at Fox Sports Radio. And Abe, let's do this. I'm really excited about this. I've seen you tweet about your distaste for baseball's unwritten rules, and that you feel like this is just archaic, that they need to be scrapped. What do you think are sports radios unwritten rules, if any?
Boy, I'm probably going to differ by market, right? I mean, like the rules that would apply to, say, a New York City or a Philadelphia, like the fan bases there are different than would apply to an Atlanta or boy, you talk about fan bases like in the Southwest or the Great Plains, some of the more college heavy as opposed to pro sports heavy. So it's probably going to depend on the market. I mean, certainly there's a ton of unwritten rules about taking phone calls, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of whether you're screening them properly, whether you change up the order and try and take it where you want it to go, whether you cut guys off, whether you have conversation. I mean, when it comes to local sports talk radio, which is different from the national scene a little bit. The local radio, it's got to be just the idea of different variations of rules you have on phone calls, because everyone sees it differently. Everyone thinks they impact a show differently, values them differently. Even at the same station, different hosts are going to use them differently. But boy, there's no shortage of unwritten rules when it pertains to phone calls. So I'd start there.
Abe Gordon is with us. You can follow him on Twitter at Abe Gordon. I'm on Twitter at Bryan Fenley. So, to your point, Abe, you've worked in Atlanta, you've worked in Cleveland, you've worked in other parts of the country. As someone who's on the air, how have you found that you've had to talk differently to sports fans based upon the city that you are in?
Well, different cities follow teams differently. And so you have to understand the knowledge base of your fans and how it pertains to each sport. I mean, when I was up in Cleveland, that's a Browns town. Always has been, always will be. But in that time, LeBron had come, and the Indians were on the precipice of making their run to the World Series. Eventually, lost to the Cubs during that regime, Terry Francona and all that. But when I was in Cleveland, you understood that they knew Browns. Like the fans there know Browns almost as well as the radio hosts and some of the broadcasters and the analysts. But Indians maybe was a little bit different. You had to be a little bit more patient there. And basketball is probably the easiest sport to discuss, especially when it's just LeBron the whole time. So, the first thing I would say is just understand where your fan base's knowledge is. I mean, here in Atlanta, when the Braves are going well, it is a Braves town. As much as the Falcons and obviously the Hawks right now are flying high, but it is a Braves town and it is Georgia football. And I'm sorry to all those Georgia Tech fans out there, because this is like a point of contention for our listeners. They always think they're getting slighted, but you to some point you have to play to the larger audience. We have a lot of people who are like Atlanta United fans, the local MLS team here, but you can't go heavy MLS. You have to weigh it with what are the other stories of the day are. So, I mean, the first thing when gauging different parts of the country, and that's you just got to understand what your fan base is interested in and what stories they can understand and relate to. Because if you go somewhere that they don't want to hear about, I mean, look, Georgia Tech had a good run in the ACC baseball tournament this year, and that's fine and dandy, but we can't focus on Georgia Tech baseball when we've got the Hawks in a playoff run and we've got the Braves, up in New York facing the Mets. And there's just other stories. So someone's going to feel slighted no matter what. You just have to gauge that and weigh it and then decide where you want to, line up your topics from there.
Yeah, it's impossible to please everyone because they're always going to want more of something that you just can't make room for, depending upon what the sport is in the market. And yeah, they're going to be upset. They might say stuff on social media. What's the worst trolling you've ever gotten from a sports fan who did not like something that was said, or the content, or how the show is formatted, or something that you did that you recall on social media?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely like people who complain about giveaways. Like it's funny, we get no interaction until we try and give something away, right? And then we can't get people to leave us alone for the next 30 minutes. I mean, the funny thing for me is I kind of just I have pretty thick skin. I think you have to have thick skin to be in the public eye. I'm a producer. I'm not in the public eye as much as my hosts, as much as you, as much as a lot of the national broadcasters and analysts. I mean, look, I see some of the tweets that like Jay Williams gets in the morning, and I can't even relate to that amount of scrutiny from people who, I mean, no offense to people, but they're not on his level.
Yeah.
For a lot of different ways, and so I've always had thick enough skin to where I just let people say their thing, and sometimes I may respond. But I almost never instigate as a secondary response. I may, give them I appreciate your input. I'll try and look at it differently next time. Of course, I ignore what they're saying, but I may try and be nice in the moment. I don't try and instigate. You can't win by doing that. Rarely are you going to turn someone.
Yeah.
Certainly, you're not going to turn them by butting heads. I mean, if you can be nice about it, which is now I will try and butt heads, but then I delete my response and never said it. No one ever sees it. I can't tell you how many of those I've done.
Yes.
Countless. But I mean, in the end, if you're going to turn someone, if you're going to bring them over to your side, if you're going to get them to respect what you're doing as a producer, it's easier to just say, be nice about it. Maybe deflect a little bit and take the conversation elsewhere. Maybe follow up and ask them a question. If they don't agree with the point you had. I normally take that route more than name callings, insults. I rarely try and ban or mute people. Again, what I say is not as important as what my hosts say, but I do think that the audience should be able to see it. If I'm going to put something out there, I do want, my base, our base as a radio station in Atlanta, to be able to access it. So I try not to ban people. If it's continual, nonstop, maybe it comes to that, but I try to avoid that when possible. So I just don't instigate as much as I probably could, as much as others that I know do. But for me, it's just easier to either ignore it or just be nice about it.
We're joined by Abe Gordon. I'm Bryan Fenley. Yeah, it's hard sometimes not to. Well, you want to be tempted to say something, but sometimes just diffusing it by just they want to be recognized, and
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah,
that's it. That's it. They just want to be acknowledged as a human being, validated, and for somebody just to say, "Hey, that's a great point," and leave it at that. Like where you don't take the conversation further. At least for me, it has been one way to diffuse what could have been something that could have grown even more. Now, you work mornings in Atlanta with Hugh Douglas and John Fricke, two legends in sports media, and certainly Hugh in the NFL. What's it like, that dynamic of working with those guys, and what makes it so seamless in the way they're able to have that chemistry?
Every show that has multiple hosts, they try and find different ways and different people and how to pair them, and that's what this grouping of John and Hugh is based on. I mean, obviously, John's a little bit older. He's old, like old Atlanta almost. I mean, he's been in Atlanta for a long time. He knows the history of the teams here, the history of the fan bases, can really speak to first time since this, or it hasn't felt this way since that. I mean, that's very important. There's certain cities people move to or move from. There are certain cities that people live in their whole lives. There's a lot of that in Atlanta. Now, certainly there are plenty of people who move to Atlanta, and to an extent, there are people who move away from Atlanta. But there's a lot of Atlanta, and I grew up here, so I'm one of them. There's a lot of Atlanta that grew up in this area, went to high school or before that in this town. So knowing the significance, the historical impact, John really brings that. And then Hugh obviously is from a different background. He's up north. He went to an HBCU. I mean, obviously was an elite, an athlete. So you know, they see things differently. You don't want to have two guys from the same background that see things the same way. When one guy says blah 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 blah, and the second guy says you're exactly right, I see it the exact same.
Yeah.
Like, that's the end of a segment. I mean, now we don't have a discussion. Now there's no rebuttal. So the idea that these two come from vastly different backgrounds, slightly different age groups, they're not so far that they can't relate to certain things that each other are talking to or referencing, but they are slightly different age groups. So there's a strength in waging that gap and finding how they relate, because for the large part of our audience, they're going to be able to relate to one or the other. We don't have a lot of our audience that relates to nobody on the show, be it my, obviously the two hosts, but, you know, I have a voice on the show, and my partner and producer, Oren, also has a voice on the show, and he and I are from different backgrounds, around the same age, but slightly different backgrounds. So we have almost the whole run of it covered when it comes to the demographics of Atlanta. And for the most part, a lot of the shows on our station can say a very similar thing. I think that's a real strength as a grouping of hosts that we have really throughout the day, middays, afternoons, evenings, the whole day on 92.9. It's pretty similar.
Yeah, you guys cover your bases, and it's so hard, I would think, at times, if you're a program director, to make a pairing work. And sometimes you throw out different options and they just don't click. But the fact is that you guys do, and that is super apparent. Abe Gordon is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley. So before you got to Atlanta, you were, and this was a couple years ago, you were working with SiriusXM and you were working in their college sports department. What was that experience like for you? Because I've run across a couple guys that we have as far as mutual friends from that time.
Yeah, SiriusXM was a wild, wild time. I moved there not too long. I don't know specifically, but not long after the merger. So I was in DC because it started with XM in DC and Sirius up in New York. I moved there after the merger when they were officially SiriusXM, as you referenced, and I was in DC. And it was a wild time because, like, I applied for the job at the NASCAR station.
Wow.
I eventually took my first job there with baseball. And then I essentially helped them boot up 3 different sports channels. I was there for the start of the soccer channel. I helped kick off the fantasy sports channel and also the college channel. So I kind of saw, like, there was a massive shift in what they were doing sports wise. And the only channel I didn't work in that was at the DC area was golf. I didn't do anything with PGA, but every other sports channel that was located there in DC, I had a hand in, whether it was just as one of the producers, which is what I was at baseball, or at the other channels, soccer, fantasy, and college. I was one of their first hires, one of the guys that led the birth of those channels. So, you know, college was interesting because, like me, a lot of people were already there within the company at different channels, but you know, you got a group of guys and gals that had their emphasis. Like, I grew up here in Atlanta, and we talked about you know, this is a college town along with the Braves town. You know, I went to Indiana, again, another school with some significant sports history. So you know, it wasn't a stretch for me, and I would have felt comfortable doing any sport. That's why I originally applied to NASCAR, but wasn't a stretch for me to do like college stuff. I mean, for me, college football still probably rules all. It's still my number one sport. If you could take, if I could save one and take all the rest, you got to keep college football for me. So it was natural for me, but we had such a good, strong group of producers, hosts, and it was, you know, we talk about these stations, these you know, discussions that get built from the ground up. It really was like we didn't poach a ton of talent in terms of on air from other channels. I mean, some of the first hosts that were on that channel are still there to this day, still have shows to this day. A couple of the original coaches, the analysts, some of them have been hired out, but a lot of them have been going for 5 or 6 years now, 7 years, almost since the inception of that channel. So there were a lot of really good hires early on there that led to that. I almost want to call. I don't want to refer to it as a single station because they've now branched out. It's now they got a Big 12 specific station, an SEC specific station, ACC specific. I mean, so and then the national one. I mean, it has grown to an extent we didn't even plan for when I was there, and I worked with some of the guys who are still there. I mean, Mark Packer is. I mean, that guy's the best. I mean, I know people say his dad Billy's a legend, but to me, Mark is an absolute legend. No one's made me laugh more.
That's a tweet. That's a tweet, by the way. I saw that tweet. You said
Which
that
one?
about Mark.
I mean, he's got 5 or 6 stories that, like, even though I've heard him tell them, I would I'll always sit and like tell people who haven't heard them, like, you got to listen to this story. I mean, he has some stuff. I don't even know if he shared all of them on air. They're all on air friendly. But man, I mean, he's got some of the best stuff I've ever heard. Chris Childers is there, and he was one of my first. I was a producer. He was one of my first hosts, and I mean, he's been grinding it. I mean, from the very bottom. I don't want to go too deep into his history, but he started as a producer elsewhere and just worked his butt off and got to the level he is now. So, the start of the college station, I mean, just so many really quality hires there. There weren't many misses there, either from the producer perspective or from the host perspective. It just kind of worked, and it's as strong today as it's ever been. It's even after I left, I kept in touch, like you said, with a lot of the people there. Some have moved on, some are still there, but it was a really nice core group. Like everyone was friends with everyone. Like even though I worked, say I would work in the mornings, I might see people who worked in the evenings. Like there were still relationships there. You don't have that at every stop. So it was really nice to see everyone got along, which I think obviously is going to help the chemistry of channel wide if there's just none of that, minor nitpicking and headbutting.
You can't bring up Mark Packer's name and talk about how funny his stories are, or tease us with that without actually telling a story. Do you have one? Let's hear one.
I don't want to share his personal stories.
Okay.
So I'll share something that happened on the air. I'm trying to remember this kid's name. I want to say this might be the wrong person, so I could be horribly wrong. I think his name was Chad Renfro. He was a basketball player at Barry down in Florida. And I caught wind that he had been attacked by a shark and was going to miss part of the season. I think they were like mostly through the season, but so I went out and we booked him on the show, and we had him on to relive the experience, talk about the attack, all this stuff. And Packer gets him on, and like maybe a question or two into the interview, he starts to rip this kid. I mean, just shred this guy on the air, and not like in such a nasty way, but more like in like, I can't understand what you're telling me sort of way. He's like, you understand, like, you can't swim, right? You can't do that. You can't do that. Like, you understand, like, why would you do it? Like, he's just questioning everything this guy's saying. And I'm doing everything I can to not cry in this control studio because I kind of knew where this was headed, because here's another kind of behind the scenes story with me and Mark Packer. And it's a little gruesome, I guess, but every time I find a story where an animal takes out a human, I send it to him, and we trade texts and we laugh about it. And so he's also got this saying, anytime you step your big toe in the water, you're on the visiting team. He's referencing going into the ocean. And so he rips this kid, and boy, when the kid got off air, it got way worse. It got way worse. I mean, but he has me crying. He has a way of doing that. Like, he's not being mean about it. Like, at no point did I feel it was mean or attacking, but man, I was crying, and he's had me crying off air and on air. I mean, no less than a dozen times. So I was super lucky to have worked with him. I know the people who pay attention to him on the ACC network now are loving it, because he is undoubtedly one of the best in the business. And really, even though he is where he is, I still think he's probably underrated. I mean, I still think he's good enough, way beyond good enough, to have hosted a national show at any point that he would have wanted to. I would put him up there with the best in the biz in terms of sports talk radio. I think he belongs in that discussion, and a lot of people may not know that, but I honestly feel that he's right there with everyone else.
You say that Mark Packer has made you cry with laughter at least a dozen times. I know somebody else who probably has even more than a dozen times. Dustin Swedelson.
Oh yeah.
So where did you first cross paths with this guy? He is now with Mad Dog Radio.
Yeah. So going back to SiriusXM and back to college, to the station there, that's where we first crossed paths. He came aboard and quickly rose through the ranks there at the college channel. And we've just been, I mean, we've been, like I said, everyone was friends there. Like we hung out, whether it was there or, when I moved on, we kept in touch. After I left college, I went to Cleveland and worked the morning show there. Worked with a couple of great hosts there for a little bit. But we kept in touch. I keep in touch with a lot of the people that I run across, if we leave on good terms. And so when I moved out to LA, I kept in touch with him. And then, as you referenced, eventually he made his way out to LA. We were roommates together for a little over a year, and then obviously still keep in touch to this day. So, I mean, it's just, he spent some time, like when we first met, he had spent some time here in Georgia, and so there were a lot of similarities there. I know he's still got family here, not too far away in Peachtree City. I think he actually has some family that live here in Atlanta too. So there was a lot of similarities in terms of discussing the SEC and college football, even high school football in the Georgia area. And the interest grew from there. Now he's a native New Yorker. So there's some problems we've run across. Traded a couple texts recently about Knicks and the Hawks, and we'll see where the relationship ends as this series ends. But no, I mean he's been great. It's been fun hanging out and being good friends with him. Definitely.
What would he say about you as a karaoke singer?
What would he say about me as a karaoke singer? It's a great question. He's probably seen me, I don't know how many songs, but at least 10 or more times we've been to karaoke together. Many of those when I was out in LA. So he would probably say, I don't take many risks with songs. Like I have a general idea of what my range is. And I try and stay within that. I think, what he would say? He would probably tell me I sing the wrong type of song. Like, cause he's more of like a classic rock, like sings some energy songs. And I have a couple of those in my repertoire. Like, but you want to sing something the whole audience is going to get behind. And sometimes I'll sing like an obscure Billy Joel song. And I'm like, oh, like when I get done, people will tell me like, that's good. I've never heard that one. I'm like, oh, that's not what you want to hear when you're at karaoke. You want something people are kind of familiar with. He'd probably say I need to stick to the classics a little bit more.
Somebody else who, with you knowing Dustin from SiriusXM, but also Travis Demers, was someone I would love to ask you about, because he is such an inspirational figure in sports media, a man who never gave up on his passions and his dreams. And it's so good to see that he's being rewarded for those. What was it like meeting him before he became big time with the Portland Trailblazers, and you saw his work ethic, you saw his grit out there?
Well, this is going to sound weird. I know Travis won't take it as a sign of disrespect, but like there was a lot of me in Travis, or a lot of him in me, vice versa, however you want to view it. Like we were relatively similar. Like I met him again, going back to the SiriusXM days. And I mean, he started, I know he's told this the story to you and all your listeners and followers, but he just started as an update anchor, and here and there, he'd get shifts, he'd get chances to host, and sometimes he'd get shafted, and he had to go back a few pegs, and he'd work his way back to where he was, so I mean, it's really refreshing to see, because a lot of times they're the producers like myself, and then there are like hosts, and even though we may be similar in age, our path is different. But Travis was kind of more like one of us. We kind of viewed him as the group that wasn't hosting every day. He was in studio with us a lot, and so he'd hang out with us when time allowed, and if we weren't all doing shifts at the same time or whatever. So he was kind of like one of us. And so when he did start to, and he went through a lot of the same struggles that I have, that a lot of sports radio producers have, where you take a risk and it doesn't work out, and you got to jump, like I mentioned, you jump back a peg, and then you build back up, and then you take a risk. And so to see him start to get that wheel in motion, start to get that ball rolling, and I talk with Travis an awful lot. I mean, at least once a month, if not more. And it used to be even more before he had a couple of kids. The man gets a little busy now, between NBA season and the children. But we still talk an awful lot, trade texts a lot. And so to see him finally get, I mean, there were a couple opportunities. We'd talk, and he'd be on the way to, a high school basketball championship where he's going to call 10 games in 2 days, or the baseball tournament, or whatever it is, or a minor league game he was calling. But to see it really get in motion in Portland, I mean, it's just so cool, like to see that. I have a couple other friends that I'm like waiting for that same break to happen for. But to see it finally come for him, and at first it was a little bit shaky ground, and then now it's become very solidified. It's just so exciting to see, again, a guy I consider like one of us to really break out and hit it big. I mean, that's just so cool. You're just so happy for him. Obviously his family, it's such a big deal for all of them. So you can't do anything but smile for a guy that has worked and deserves it. So it's just fun. It's awesome.
I hope those other friends you were talking about get that opportunity as well. And I know that time and persistence, it's all going to play into their favor, and they will hopefully get that opportunity. I am very hopeful about that. How about TJ Coutini? How far do you go back with him?
Again, we're going back to SiriusXM. It feels like a lot of our common friends go back there, but he came in not too long after we had started the college channel, and so I go back there with him. And again, is a guy that had worked in the South and kind of understood that, and he was another one that he was technically my boss, or one of my bosses, but he was another one. And maybe this is what was special about the group we had at SiriusXM, right? Because, I just told you that Travis, who worked in the update anchor desk, felt like one of us. TJ, even though he was above us, even though we went to him for permission on things or to get clearance on stuff, very easy to talk to. I wasn't scared. You don't never want to be scared of your boss. Like, you want to understand the hierarchy, but you don't really want to be scared of your boss. I don't think that's a healthy relationship. I've been in certain markets or jobs where you are scared of your boss, but I've also been in others where you can go to your boss for conversations and feel comfortable questioning things and having the tough discussions in that realm. And I can get into that later too, because I have an explanation of why that works for me. And I don't necessarily think it works for everyone, but for me, it does. But TJ always felt comfortable, and so he always understood the challenges we were having, and tried to help that. And I think that that goes a long way to your employees liking you as a boss. So, but yeah, we go way back, and so he was great for us, and he was still there when I left. So, yeah, TJ is a great guy too. He works hard. He works very hard as well.
Yeah, he does. You do. What's the hardest you've had to work to get your name in front of a decision maker or to get an opportunity?
I can the hardest I ever worked was back at SiriusXM, because there was a summer where I was working baseball. I was trying to help start up the fantasy channel, and between that, and this is like the first like week or two of the fantasy channel. I mean, the very early days. Um, but it was also the summer, and it was the World Cup, and I was one of the lead producers for the soccer channel, and did a lot of on-air stuff back then for the World Cup. So, I mean, we're talking about like a 3-week stretch where literally 7 days a week, I worked 17-hour days for 3 different channels. And I remember turning in my timesheet, and I turned in a timesheet that was billed on a 2-week period, 183 hours. And my boss was just like, or the varying bosses, because I had to deal with 3 of them at the time. They're like, we can't turn in a 183-hour timesheet. That's not going to work. So I mean, we spread it out over like the next 3 months, and I got paid for everything, and it didn't bother me. But I mean, I loved it. But there does come a time where you start to get worn down. I mean, when you're dealing with 5 or 6 hours worth of sleep for 2 to 3 weeks at a time, it starts to add up. So, I mean, in terms of like physically, the hardest I've ever worked is definitely that, because that was. But the difference was, you knew the World Cup comes to an end, right? Like, you knew there was a finish line in sight. So there's a way to power through that. And, there were certain off days between the end of the group stage and the knockout rounds. So that was always in your mind. You're like, this is just a short-term thing. We can all battle through this. But in terms of the other one, I mean, and I'm still working through this sometimes, is just, some people see you as a producer. Some people see you as the chance to expand beyond just production. So I remember my first job in Tampa. I started there just as a part-time producer. I was making, I don't know, $8 an hour, $7.50, whatever it was. My first job out of college. And I worked a bunch of shows, and then finally I was run all over the city covering events, whether it was a Bucks game, South Florida sporting events, whatever it was, and then finally worked up to where they gave me a slot doing updates. Finally, from there, got a slot hosting, and then did a bunch of varying shows from there. So it's not that didn't take long. It actually was a lot quicker than I expected it to be. But that was a situation where, like, I made known the idea that in addition to producing, I wanted to host, I wanted to do this. I mean, your first job, you want to do a little bit of everything if you're allowed to. So that was one. I wouldn't say it was necessarily hard, but that I did fight for a little bit. I was kind of a little mosquito on my boss's leg. I was always there nipping, just reminding him what I'm interested in doing. So those are probably my 2 answers there.
You have to have that sort of persistence. We are joined by our guest, Abe Gordon, with 92.9 The Game in Atlanta. I'm Bryan Fenley. And when you've found yourself, Abe, in between jobs, where have you found it the hardest, and how have you overcome that? What have you done to continue to believe in yourself, even when, as you know, this business has the highs and lows that come with it?
Yeah, you know what the hardest part is, and this is probably the quickest I'll answer, is that when you get down to being a finalist and it doesn't come down to you. I don't think I have an ego as a producer, but I am confident. I'm confident in the work I've done, what my resume says, and so when I apply to a job, I think I'm going to get that job. Like literally, I think here's here's the application, like. And I expect in however many weeks, however many interviews, that they're going to offer me. And so when I get to the final stage of something and they call me and say, hey, we're going with someone else, like that's for me is what was always toughest to take, because I kind of in my head, I already am telling myself, oh, let's start looking at apartments. Let's do this. Let's do that. Like, And so that for me, those setbacks were always the toughest to take. And especially if it's a big job, if it's one you really, that I really wanted. I mean, there's been smaller jobs that I lost out on, and I was surprised, but it didn't break my back, for whatever reason. But some of those bigger jobs that I think, when you lose a job for whatever reason, and I've worked for startups that don't succeed, and that's part of working for a startup, right? That's part of the risk you take. So I'm not hurt by the idea that I lost a job and whatever. But man, when I'm getting that close to a job that I really want and it ends up not being me, I feel like that's a bigger setback than anything else. So, but in terms of the drive to keep going and keep applying, I mean, look, and you know this, and I'm sure a lot of people who are watching are probably in a similar boat. This is not the easiest market to just throw out your resume and find a job. There's few jobs that come open, fewer that are of interest, and a ton of candidates. Everyone wants to get in on this market, right? Especially right out of college. They love to just get their foot in the door no matter what the role is. So it's not the easiest job to like be in the long term for. And for me, I've felt very lucky to have moved around as much as I have, experienced as much as I have, worked different types of jobs in the same business. I mean, that's incredible. And I'm very proud of what my resume says. But I mean, the idea that if you lose a job that could be your last in this market, I mean, that's a real thought. Not just for me, but for a lot of people who maybe don't get lucky and don't get their foot back in the door. So for me, it's just keep searching when I have had those downtimes, keep grinding, keep looking, and stay close with your contacts. I mean, we've referenced how many people here just from SiriusXM. I mean, I still keep in touch with a lot of people from my very first job in Tampa. Still keep in touch with a lot of people from Cleveland, obviously LA. I mean, while I don't think you rely on your contacts to get you the job, it never hurts to have ins wherever you can. And so, you never want that. It's why that's the other, just like we talked about on Twitter, I try not to instigate. I try and keep those relationships. You never know what's going to come back. Like this is one thing I've always said, like, cause when I was in Tampa, one of my interns is now a host on SportsCenter. And it's like, you never know who's going to be where 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 25 years from now. You just never know how people's lives are going to present themselves, when your paths are going to cross again. You don't want to burn those bridges ever if you can avoid it. And look, I would say my contacts have been a little bit beneficial, not like to the highest extent. I haven't gotten a job from many of them, but that doesn't mean I won't in the future. I have always said that I very rarely leave a place just on bad terms. And I think that's important to remember because people move around in this business and you just never know where someone's going to be. So, boy, if I could give some advice, that might be near the top of the list. Just always keep in good standing with your former colleagues because you never know when you may need their help again.
Yeah, I'm with you. And it's a learning process because what you're saying, at least when I'm hearing that, when I was first trying to get in, I'm not going to admit that I knew everything. I've made my mistakes. I've made my mistakes and perhaps early on overreaching and bothering people too much. So you have to learn, but eventually you figure out what's a good amount as far as how you pursue and the relationships. That's super key. And I also think when you're reaching out, how you reach out is so key as well, because especially if you're doing it via an email, I've learned it's not about, I mean, you don't want to come at somebody like you're adding a burden to them. Like you want to come at them like you're fixing something, or that you want to come at it from a non-threatening perspective of just like, I just would just enjoy shaking your hand. I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm not here to ask for a job. I'll be at this event. You might be as well. Do you have a minute where I could just shake your hand? and then build up that relationship. Because I'm not one to learn now and how my experiences have evolved to say that I think that the best thing to do is just to blind ask somebody for a job. I think like if you've built up those relationships over time, then they're always going to keep you in mind, Abe. And then I think it's going to prove fruitful for you. My last question, Abe Gordon is with us. What's the most proud you've been with yourself in how you've handled and reviewing your career? Something that tangibly you looked at and said, man, I deserve to give myself more credit for.
Boy, uh yikes, that's a great question. That really is. Because I don't really sit and reflect on my own career a ton. Um, like I know my parents are like, I can't believe you're still doing sports radio. Like that's incredible. But for me, I always felt like that was just I was always going to do something in sports. So I mean, I would say this. I feel like every time I leave a job, I'm better than I was before. Like a couple years ago, like I said, I keep in touch with the guys I produced for when I was in Tampa, and like this is a number of years ago. I texted them and said, guys, I'm sorry, I was a terrible. I literally texted them and said this. I was a terrible producer for you guys, and I apologize. And we're friends, and so it wasn't anything. I didn't think too much about it, but it was just like I can look back and see how bad I was then compared to now. And the same thing has every step of the way. I feel like I've improved. I really, I don't feel like I certainly haven't gone backwards, haven't gotten lazier, haven't, become more reserved, anything like that. But I mean, I would almost say that's what I'm proud of is just, I keep trying to improve. Cause look, I'm not the best. I'm not the best producer in the country by any stretch. Um, there are guys that I'm friends with that I'm like, that guy's a way better producer than me, and I need to get on their level. But that, I mean, you just got to keep trying, and so I would say one of the proudest things is that I have gotten better as I've gone on. And to your point about coming in not knowing everything, that's a major part of it. Once you could admit to yourself that, and it doesn't even have to be your first job that you admit that to. It can sometimes be way down the road because a lot of people come in with their first job and say they don't know everything, but 3 years later, in the same role, maybe they're like, all right, I got this down. But then you realize, so it might be 3 years later, it might be 5 years later, it might be a decade in the game where you have to admit to yourself, maybe I don't know everything. And then the other aspect of that, the other part of me still improving, be ready to learn from anyone and from everywhere. It might be another host or producer's first show, and they.
Oh, I was wondering
The
when we
dog's
were going to
up.
get this celebrity appearance,
up,
or at
yeah.
least the audio version of that. Oh.
But do you want to lay down? You're right.
Oh, you got a rebellious teenager in the house.
Yeah. She's getting in her old age. She's go up there. Come here.
Oh.
But yeah, I mean, you can learn from anyone, whether it's their first day on the job, whether they've been there a month, whether they've been there a year, whether they're an intern or whether they're the station manager or they control the market. Like, be willing to accept it from any angle, from anyone, and never stop being open to those lessons. I mean, I think that is something I have done pretty well throughout my career in this industry, is just always be willing to adapt, to learn, and to be inclusive of whoever it may be. So one thing I will always say is that I have left each job as a better producer than I was when I came there. And I am pretty proud of that aspect.
He is sports radio's chameleon. It is Abe Gordon with the 8-year-old husky chipper in the background. Abe, I'm going to let you get back to your daughter there and your dog. I appreciate you so much. I'm Bryan Fenley. This was a great conversation. Really appreciate your time.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Bryan.